All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Troy McKenzie. I have the honor of being the Dean of NYU School of Law, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome to this law school two extraordinary leaders who are with us this evening. Eric Holder, former Attorney General of the United States, and Dr. Sharon Malone. I am going to give very brief introductions and then get out of the way, which is what a good dean should do. Eric H. Holder Jr. served as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, the third longest serving Attorney General in US history, and the first African American to hold that office. As I just told him, he doesn't know this, but he actually appointed me to a position in the Department of Justice. I have a document with his signature on it, so it's evidence, just in case. General Holder is an internationally recognized leader across a broad range of regulatory enforcement, criminal justice, and national security issues. He served in government for more than 30 years, having been appointed to various positions requiring US Senate confirmation by Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Reagan. He was appointed by President Reagan to the DC Superior Court, appointed by President Clinton to positions of US Attorney for DC and Deputy Attorney General of the United States, and appointed by President Obama as Attorney General. And he is currently at Covington and Burling in Washington, DC. We are thrilled as well to welcome Sharon Malone, MD, who is a nationally recognized expert in women's health. She is currently Chief Medical Officer at Alloy Women's Health, a telehealth company that focuses on women over 40. Previously, Dr. Malone was a partner at one of the oldest and most successful OBGYN medical practices in Washington. She is board certified by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and certified as well by the North American Menopause Society. Throughout her professional career, she has been a leader in reproductive rights, reducing teen pregnancy, and eliminating healthcare disparities. And as you may have realized, our two esteemed guests happen to know each other very well. They have been married to one another for many years. They reside in Washington, DC, and they are the parents of three now young adults. Tonight, they will be in conversation with NYU Law's Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, who is the phenomenal new executive director of our Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. Jen has worked on women's health initiatives with Dr. Malone, including by co-authoring a Washington Post op-ed this past spring on menopause research. We're grateful to our many co-hosts for this evening's program: NYU Law's Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, our Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, the Brennan Center for Justice, and also the university's John Bradamus Center. So with that, I will now pass the microphone over to Jen to begin this evening's conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I've been looking forward to this conversation for so long. I joined the NYU community about 3 months ago as the executive director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. And among the early conversations I was having with students were real, thoughtful discussions about what it means to live a full life in law in pursuit of justice, how to balance that with the desire to be happy and harmonious in one's personal life. And as I was talking to them and sort of listening to this concern, this angst, this energy, Sharon was the first person who came to my mind. And I texted her and said, what do you think about having this conversation? A little different than the kind of panels perhaps we're accustomed to having here at the law school. So anyway, I can't wait to jump into it with both of you. You can tell me if anything's off limits or if we're getting a little too game showy or dating game like. But anyway, so I'm gonna jump in, and you can hold up the red card if I say no, don't go there. But actually, the biographies that that Dean Kenzie just read are obviously extraordinary. They're kind of a sizzle reel of what I'm sure is a much richer and much rockier life. So I'm going to ask you to do a quick bio of the other one. What would you say about the other one's professional pursuits, how they've been part of your professional pursuits? You occupied very different places in some ways in our society, in our culture, medicine, law, although we know that they overlap and intersect. So I would just love to hear how you would describe the other one's career and commitments.
You want
We
me
got
to,
a green light.
you want
Well,
me to
I'm
start?
looking at you, so
Okay, I'll start.
You can start. You two can decide between you who
Okay.
should start.
Can I take notes on this?
Well, Eric and I met in 1989, and at that point I was a young resident. Eric was a newly appointed judge in the DC Superior Court, and at that point in my life, I said, wow, this is really great. We got married a year later, and I said, I've got this really stable guy with a good government job. He's gonna go to work, he's gonna come home, and he's a judge, so you don't bring your work home with you. And I thought, I'll be the one who comes and goes, and I'm gonna, OB resident. And I kind of feel like it was a bait and switch operation here. Because right after when I needed him most, right after the birth of our first child, Eric says, well, I've got this, job opportunity to be the U.S. Attorney in DC. And I said, well, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, not only did it mean countless hours of, work after work hours, it also involved a substantial pay cut. And I'm like, hey, dude, you are working your way down the ladder of success. Every job he got after that, he made less money. I was like, I said, how does this work? But I say that to say, we embarked on an amazing journey that neither of us knew that we were going to be on. But it became very apparent to me that he was very committed, that he cared deeply about justice and equality, and that was something that he wanted to do not only for the people in the District of Columbia, but for the people of the United States. And I had to get with that, but let me say, it was not an easy process, and I don't want to give anyone, and particularly young people, the impression that it's all roses. There's a lot of hard times, when you have two busy people doing what we both think are important things, and you have to take turns. And that's the give and take of what Eric and I have done over these past 32 years, is that we have to learn that, you give, you take, but at the end of the day, I've always respected the fact that he is doing something that is important, not just for our family, but for everyone.
Wow. I'm ready to just stop here and go home. Well, here's the deal, kind of biographical. I'm married into civil rights royalty. Sharon's sister, the late Vivian Malone, was the young African-American woman who in 1963, with the help of the Justice Department, integrated the University of Alabama. When George Wallace was standing in the schoolhouse door and there were these two African-American students, one of them was Sharon's sister, Vivian. Vivian, obviously that was a historical moment, but she went on to do a variety of other things, including working at the Justice Department. And so her whole family, Sharon's family, is really focused on, and has been focused on, making things better for people in this country, and in particular African Americans. She's from Mobile, Alabama. I'm from Queens in New York. So we had a lot in common there. Although I will say that 24th Avenue and 101st Street, where I'm from, in East Elmhurst, is very similar, I think, in terms of the makeup of the community, the sensibility of the people, to St. Anthony Street, where she is from in Mobile. And I remember when I met her that night at for a reception for an organization I was a part of, Concerned Black Men. We're just telling the truth here, Sarah.
I was very concerned about black men at that time.
And a friend of mine from East Elmhurst said, I got this woman I think you should meet. And I was like, I just broken up with somebody. I said, nah, I'm good, man. I'm just going to take some time off. And he said, it's her. I looked and I went, well, she looks very smart. So I was taken with her brains, obviously. And I said, yeah, I definitely want to meet her. And so we met, and that was, I guess, in February. We were married in April of the next year. And Sharon's right. This has been, it's been a journey. And it has not always been smooth sailing. I think certainly, as she was talking about, when I was U.S. Attorney and Deputy Attorney General, and our kids were small, I was not as present as I should have been. And she shouldered substantially greater loads than she should have. She was an OBGYN, delivering babies, taking calls in the middle of the night, most of which I could actually handle after a while. I mean, I could, how far apart are the contractions? I could write prescriptions for certain things. I mean, just kind of listening in. But and that created tension, created tension that we had to somehow navigate. But our affection for one another on a personal level, and I think the respect that we had for each other, given the professional lives that we had, is what I think ultimately, saw us through. And I went into private practice after I left the Justice Department when Al Gore did not lose the election. When Al Gore, when George Bush became president, and things I think became a little easier then. I actually had a job for the first time where my salary went up. And when I went back into government, I said, I'm not going to repeat those same mistakes. I'm going to be there, I'm going to be present, I'm going to have a better work-life balance. I can't do to her what I did before. And I think I did a better job in that second go-round. Maybe not perfect, but better. So this is a woman I love. But beyond that, this is a woman for whom I have the utmost respect, and she consistently surprises me with something new. She's now engaged in this raising the awareness of the nation with regard to issues around menopause. She's in the process of writing a book. She's doing this telehealth thing, and this is after she retired from her practice at one of the premier practices, OBGYN practices in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much both for that. That just confirmed every instinct I had that this was the right conversation to have here tonight. You're both really a model. And it's interesting, okay, so you brought up Vivian Malone, and you got ahead of my list of questions here.
Sorry.
Because that was my next question. Your book is dedicated to Vivian for walking through those doors. I was really moved in the parts of the book where you wrote about seeing her on TV for the first time when you were 12 years old,
Right.
At University of Alabama, and then there for the signing of the Voting Rights Act. So I wanted each of you actually to talk a little bit about Vivian's life and legacy. I've heard you tell me about it, Sharon, but I think everybody would benefit from hearing a little bit about from both of you. But then I also have a question for you, A.G. Holder. Were you stunned when you realized that you were meeting Vivian Malone's sister? That seems pretty extraordinary. So anyway, I'll stop editorializing and let you each tell Vivian from your own words. I would love to hear that.
Okay.
Vivian, she's my oldest sister, and unfortunately, she passed away about 17 years ago. And after my mother died, I lived with Vivian. So she was not only like a big sister / aunt, she was also a mother figure to me. And when she went to the University of Alabama, I was 4. So I don't remember it as it happened, but I certainly have relived that experience many, many times through our family's stories about it. I do remember when she graduated because by then I was old enough to remember and to go. I did not really understand how significant that day was. I mean, you have to understand, this was 1963. And for those of you who are too young to remember George Wallace as he existed at the time, he was the prototype for President Trump. Imagine, he's the original Trump. He was he said what he said, and he didn't take it back. And his campaign motto was segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And that was why.
Subtle.
Yeah. But that was why he felt it was important to make that stand at the University of Alabama on that day. And it did require the President of the United States and the U.S. Department of Justice to go down to make sure that she got through that door safely. But it wasn't really until I think my daughters were the age that Vivian was when that happened. And when that day in 1963, Vivian was 20 years old. And to put in perspective to you what had happened in 1963 was an incredibly tumultuous year in Alabama. Martin Luther King was jailed and wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail. The Children's March happened, and those are those iconic photos where you see the dogs and the fire hoses on the children who were marching. 2 weeks before the confrontation at the University of Alabama, the Gadsden Motel, which is the only segregated motel in Birmingham at that time, had been bombed. So my sister, accompanied by the Justice Department attorneys and her local attorneys, they had to stay in the homes of their lawyer's secretary because no one had to know where they were. Birmingham was known as Bombingham. So my parents had to let their 20-year-old daughter go to the University of Alabama alone because they said, you know what, we can't take care of all of you, so we don't worry, we've got her. So my parents didn't know where she was, or she would get to call home occasionally, and it's hard to believe, but this is pre-cell phone, pre-texting, and they just had to have faith that she was going to be okay in very uncertain times. They got there that day, and again, a very, very hot day, that June 11th, and got turned back, had to go back, regroup, come back with the National Guard to allow them to enroll in the University of Alabama. And when you think for a moment, okay, well, okay, no one got shot, everyone's safe here tonight. Vivian and James Hood, who was the other student, they went to bed in their dorms that night, and they woke up the next morning to find out that just after midnight, that was the night that Medgar Evers was shot and killed in his driveway. And that is how they started their first day of school at the University of Alabama. I can't even imagine what that's like. So when my children said, "Oh, Mom, I'm so stressed out," I'm like, "Oh, please." But there was always the threat. There were bomb threats. She'd go to class and they'd have to evacuate, or she'd go to class and students would get up and leave. And I said, when my oldest daughter turned 20, the one thing that came to my mind was, what on earth were my parents thinking? That would be like just sending your child to, why don't you go to school at the University of Afghanistan? I mean, what could happen? But I realized then what that moment meant to her, what she had to endure, what my parents had to endure and believe. And I think that it speaks volumes about what African Americans in this country, what faith we had in a system that always didn't have faith in us. And it mattered, and I kind of saw that whole event from a very different perspective, not from the perspective of a little sister who's watching her big sister, but from a mother who realizes that you are having your daughter placed in near or certain danger. So I had to, I look at it differently. And the thing about my sister that I want you to really take away is that if that's the only thing she ever did in her life was go to the university, stand down the governor of Alabama, and graduate successfully,
And understand that 2 students who enroll, but only Vivian graduates.
Right.
Jane Hood only lasts for how long?
Just he didn't make it through the summer session.
Right.
So when the fall came, she was alone. He had to leave. He didn't, there were a lot of things he didn't, different pressures, and he could not take it. So she was there alone. And this is where it gets to the commonality and sort of perspective that Eric and I have. I come from a family where my parents were not allowed to vote. This is Alabama. So things like voting rights mattered, and it mattered to us in a very different way than it matters to the generation who takes just voting rights for granted. And my sister, after she graduated from the University of Alabama, she couldn't get a job in the state of Alabama, so she came to Washington, D.C. and worked in the U.S. Department of Justice. And she lived a life of service. She worked at the Justice Department. She worked at the Environmental Protection Agency. She was the director of their first Office of Environmental Justice. She was ahead of her time. And she also worked as the executive director of the Voter Education Project. So I say this,
Succeeding John Lewis.
Yes. But there is this, this little girl from Mobile, Alabama meets this guy who still claims to be a New Yorker, even though he's lived in D.C. for 40 years.
Whoa.
But
New York now, New York forever.
Meanwhile, I have renounced my Alabama citizenship.
Well, that makes sense.
But I say that to say, and he's of West Indian descent, and my parents are, 6th generation Alabamians, but there was a lot that was that we had in common that we didn't even know that we had in common. It wasn't immediately obvious.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, I looked at the Vivian interaction with George Wallace in a slightly different way. I was watching a black and white TV in my basement in Queens. I'm 12 years old. But even then I realized, wow, she's really good looking. In addition to all what's going on, I'm not totally, I think, understanding what's happening here. Because I'm watching, I'm like, why she can't go to the college that she wants to go to? I grew up in New York, and I have West Indian parents from the Pearl of the Caribbean, Barbados. So all you Jamaicans, Trinidadians, and to think, to answer your question, to think that I would, and it's interesting that all the dynamics that happen, how small the world is. The person who escorted her that day was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Nick Katzenbach, who I got to know later on when we served on a corporate board, and we became, very, very close. And his portrait was one that I had in my personal office when I was Attorney General. I wanted Nick to be as close to me as is possible. But to watch what happened on television and to think that some years later I was going to meet and then marry this young woman who I see on television integrating in the University of Alabama, I was going to marry her sister, that was really kind of, I would not have imagined that.
And to even think that you would someday have the same office that Nick Katzenbach had, and this was something, the only regret that I have, that Vivian did live to see Eric become the Deputy Attorney General, and she was extremely, extremely proud. And don't tell anybody, but she used to say that Eric was her favorite brother-in-law. And I do have lots of other sisters, so that means something. But so there are these these intersections of, who would have figured that Eric would have that job? Because then, obviously, in 1963, that was inconceivable that we would have a Black Deputy Attorney General, let alone Attorney General and ultimate president.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot us a little bit to a little more of the here and now, and something that you said actually, Sharon, a couple weeks ago when Sharon's also on the board of the Center for Reproductive Rights. So I had the pleasure of hearing you speak at their gala a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about the marriage of law and medicine and your, and that is part of your commitment to service for that particular organization, which is a legal organization. And so I started thinking on that phrase, the marriage of law and medicine, because that also tells a bit of the story of both of you. And I'm curious how how each of your careers has influenced the other's perspective. I know that when we worked, for example, on the op-ed in the Washington Post about menopause research, and I'll just give a quick sidebar that a piece that we wrote together has actually resulted in legislation that's been introduced to advance the ideas we wrote about. But that's the marriage of law and medicine. That's what happens when you marry those two expertises and perspectives. That's you set a particular path in motion. It wasn't just a good idea. It was a good idea really zeroed in on what legislation or what particular reform could look like. But that's a little bit of the story of the two of you too. So your careers are so distinct. And you can go in any order. I keep looking at you because you're next to me, but we can go in any order here. How the other's career has impacted how you've carried out your own career.
Well, let me just say this. I think the intersection of law and medicine has always been, and particularly when it comes to issues of women's reproductive rights in medicine and law. And it starts from the beginning, who does a woman belong to? Does she have her own agency? To the anti-miscegenation laws, who a woman is allowed to love and have children with, to forced sterilization, to who can have contraception. I mean, there is that we have a long, varied history of the legal profession and the laws dictating what women can and cannot do with their own bodies. So when we get to, Roe v. Wade, we think, well, yay, we've gotten here. Now we at least have that part of the agency, we've taken it back. So it's disturbing. It's disturbing to me on a lot of levels that we are now in a position where, simple things, where we've gone from forced sterilization to forced birth. How did we get here in 2022? So I think that, it has always been, from my perspective as being an OBGYN and being intimately involved in women's reproductive rights and options, it's been distressing to me on any number of levels that this is where we are. And I must say, I'm surprised, but I don't think that this is necessarily the end all and be all. And we have got to figure out how we're going to do this. And to do this, we're going to have to have the legal profession and the legislation changed. So that's where you come in.
Yeah, I'm on it. But I think, there's a marriage here of a doctor and a lawyer, but I think the way you describe it is a good one, a marriage of medicine and the law. For all you law students, we all studied Griswold. And I remember studying Griswold and thinking, really? Government's going to tell you if you can, a married couple, whether or not you can use, contraception? How is this possible? All right, obviously, from my perspective, obviously a good decision. Right to privacy, that has a huge impact on a whole range of, of other issues, whole range of other areas, and yet all the areas in the way Sharon described it, the ability of the law or the desire of men to use the law to control women is a theme that you see throughout our history. And so in marrying this, this doctor, it was interesting, some of the practical things. I couldn't share with her what was going on with regard to grand jury information, and she couldn't share with me what was going on with doctor-patient matters. So just in a practical way, I'll get back to the serious, but there were things that we couldn't tell each other. She'd only read about in the newspaper after I'd been working on something, or when Sherry Sprague, who was, I guess I can say her name, who was the number 3 person when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, came in to tell me that she was pregnant. So I said, wow, that's really great, Sherry, that's great. So I went home to tell Sharon, hey, Sharon, Sherry Sprague is pregnant. And Sharon said, okay, I know. She was her doctor. And she had known this for many weeks. So that's just a practical thing. But that the confluence of law and medicine goes beyond just the medical field and just beyond the involvement of women. It really kind of seeps out into other parts of our constitutional view of how our society should be ordered. There's a lot of foundational things that are found in and the way women have been treated, and the way medicine has had an impact.
Okay, so we're going to pivot this even more now to this wonderful book that's next to me. A lot of how we've considered reproductive health in particular is inextricably connected to the attacks on democracy. That we have unrepresentative state legislatures, although after the midterms, maybe the balance has shifted a little bit. We certainly don't have a judiciary that reflects the majority will, just even based on procedural matters. So I'm going to start with you, A.G. Holder, to talk to us about your book, The Fight for Democracy and Justice, the reforms you propose, but how those are particularly relevant to the reproductive issues that are at the core of Sharon's work and that are on the minds of so many people in America right now, including many here at the law school and lots of our students.
Yeah, the book, Legis has three components to it. First is the history of the fight for the vote, various groups fighting to get the right to vote. An analysis of kind of the present situation in which we find ourselves. And then the third part, it really deals with some concrete proposals about how we might get ourselves to a better place. It's interesting to see that as we look at in that first part, in the history part, groups fighting for the right to vote. The first group to demand the right to vote were white men who didn't have property. Not denied the right to vote. And they said, whoa, what up? We can go to war, we can do all these other things. We want the right to vote. As that is considered, the founders say, some of the founders say, well, if you give white men who don't have property the right to vote, other groups are going to ask for the right to vote, including, perish the thought now, women. And sure enough, women are the next group that demand, fight for, and get the right to vote. African Americans get the right to vote, lose the right to vote, fight for the right to vote. And so the first part of the book is all about that struggle, some people who you might not know about, get to the present situation, and just dealing in the reproductive area because of some practices that we need to deal with. Chief among them, because I'm the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that is trying to do away with this problem of partisan and racial gerrymandering. But because of gerrymandering, you have the ability in the state legislatures to pass these draconian anti-choice, forced birth bills that are inconsistent with the desires of the people who these state legislators represent. I mean, if you look at the polling, every state, the people in every state said they did not want to have Roe versus Wade overturned. Now, the percentages would be different in New York, maybe as opposed to Texas, but over 50% in every state. And yet, we see these state legislatures, gerrymandered state legislatures with people in these politically safe seats. They only worry about a primary. They're not concerned about a general election. Passing these laws that take us back, way back, inconsistent again with the desires of the people of this country. And I understand that we want to have our judges insulated, and they're going to sometimes make decisions that are unpopular, but ultimately prove to be just. And yet, that combination of gerrymandering, as I talk about in the book, the theft of 2 Supreme Court seats, the radicalization of the court, has put us in a place where, in a whole variety of areas, our democracy is at risk. For the last year, 18 months, I've been saying to people in speeches that I've been giving, inflation matters. The price of gas matters. The ability to get baby formula matters. But what's on the ballot is our democracy. We're voting for our democracy. And I kept hammering. And I think in at least some of the data that we've been able to analyze, that was a driver. It was not necessarily inflation to the extent that the media was telling us. People were more concerned about our democracy, the potential loss of it, and abortion. Those were, at least, again, this is preliminary data that we're looking at, those appear to be the two major drivers. And so in part 3, I deal with, as I said, some specific suggestions with regard to the executive branch, judicial branch, legislative branch, and about how we can reclaim our democracy.
I have a question about solutions too. So this might be a place to put those forward if you want to share
Sure.
at least the highlights with folks. I can go out of order on my script.
Yeah, I mean, Supreme Court, you have to have term limits, to have people in unelected positions for 30, 40 years with that degree of power, I think is inconsistent with our notion of both a connected judiciary. It can be insulated, but connected, connected. Have a sense of, where the people are. As I note in the book, it's one of the few places where Chief Justice Roberts and I agree. I say you should have them 18-year terms. He says 15-year terms in a speech that he gave, that there should be limits. I say 18 years because another part of the proposal is that presidents should appoint a justice to the Supreme Court in the first year of his or her term and the third year of his or her term. So if you're president, you're going to appoint 2 justices in every term. If they serve 18 years, over time, it will mean that the court will shrink. It'll expand in the short term, but ultimately will get down to 9 justices. We have these strategic retirements now. In the beginning of our country, people left the court because they died. And they passed away at earlier ages than people do now. Now people leave the court when they have a president who they know is going to appoint somebody consistent with their ideology. This is Democrats as well as Republicans. And so having that mandatory first, third year appointment, 18-year terms makes a great deal of sense. Legislative branch, I'll just go through these quickly. You got to do away with the filibuster. The use of the filibuster has gone up dramatically since the 90s. I mean, you kind of see it like this, civil rights bill, boop, civil rights bill, boop, always used to stop civil rights bills. And then suddenly, it goes like that. And now people somehow think, well, to get something through the Senate, you have to have 60 votes. No, you don't. That's just a rule that they've come up with. That is, again, the founders, when they looked at this notion of supermajorities, rejected them and said that no, we should have majority rule, having had a negative experience with the Articles of Confederation. Legislative branch, other things. I mean, mandatory 14 days of early voting. Make election day a national holiday. Automatic registration when you turn 18. A new voting rights bill that would apply the Voting Rights Act of 1965, make it consistent with, make it something that will survive constitutional scrutiny by this court, but apply it nationwide, not just to the Old South, because the problems that we have with regard to voting are not restricted just to Alabama and Mississippi and the old Confederacy. The most gerrymandered state in the country now is probably Wisconsin. Problems in Ohio. Problems in Pennsylvania, so this is something that is really nationwide in scope. So there are a range of proposals in the book, and what I say is that people look at them and say, well, "You're asking too much, Eric. We can't do all of that stuff." But what the history part tells us is that generations before us had to face a whole series of issues and had to defend our democracy, and they rose to the challenge. I refuse to believe that this generation will not rise to the challenges of our time and defend our democracy. And what I think we saw last Tuesday is the first step, the first indication that this generation is up to that challenge. I don't say that we're out of the woods yet. I think our democracy is still at risk, but as Churchill said, I think we might be at the end of the beginning.
Can I just say one quick thing about the Voting Rights Act? It's because this is, again, one of these serendipitous things that happened. When Eric when you were Attorney General, and they were celebrating the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and he was speaking at the Johnson Presidential Library, and he was standing at the podium, and they were putting slides up of the signing of the Voting Rights Act behind him.
I was going out to use the teleprompters, wanted to make sure they were all set.
Yeah.
So I look up,
and he looks up, and there's this picture there of Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act, and then there's Martin Luther King is there, and lo and behold, on the edge of the picture is my sister. I had no idea. That was 10 years ago that I found that? No idea that she was there. But as I said, that first job that she had just as she graduated the University of Alabama in 1965, she was at the Justice Department. And so again, this is a very personal story of my family because I was like, my goodness. And of course, she never told me she was at the signing of the Voting Rights Act. But, you know, we have this proof that it's like, yes, it has been a through line in my family that voting was always very important because of the fact that the right was so precious.
And that I was going to be connected to Vivian in so many, you know, different ways. Because as I came out,
Yeah.
I'm looking at the teleprompters and the speech and all that stuff, and I look up, and I see Vivian with white gloves on, and she's to the left of the picture, along as you can see President Johnson, Martin Luther King, a whole variety of senators, and young Vivian Malone.
It's manifest. And Sharon shared that picture with me before, and I've shared it with all of our fellows who are here. But if there are folks who are registered and would like the picture, I'm happy to, we're happy at BWLN to send that picture around. It really is stunning. I know that we're at time, we promised folks that there'd be a Q&A time, so if folks do have questions, you're welcome to start lining up at microphones. We'll have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, so folks should step up if you do right now. I'll keep going if folks don't, but if we have people who do, I would love to hand over the mic. So I think maybe you can just lift it right up there. That seems
Good
to work.
evening, everyone, and thank you for the excellent conversation. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what happened in Kansas, and if you see that as a bellwether of what lies ahead. Thank you very much.
You know, isn't that amazing? Kansas. Oh, you know, there was a referendum for, whether or not, now that's the whole thing. Well, since we've outlawed, Roe v. versus Wade has been overturned. And now it's up to the individual states to codify, to give this right to women within the states. In Kansas, you think of conservative Kansas, and if you win in Kansas, my goodness, I think that certainly has to be a bellwether. And as Eric was saying, there's not a state where women and people don't feel that is important for an important right for women to have. And it's just a matter of figuring out how we're going to do it. I personally don't think it should be left up to individual states because, there's always Mississippi. But that's what we say in Alabama, by the way. But it should be, again, that shouldn't be something that should be a patchwork decision that each individual state gets to decide, because why should a woman who lives in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia have any different rights than a woman who lives in, Missouri or New York for that matter? So yes, but that was very encouraging that, that passed in Kansas. Don't you think?
No, I think that's right. I think it is a bellwether. I mean, I think, again, the data that we're looking at shows that it was a driver for getting out the Democratic progressive base, had an impact on suburban women. Again, this is all just preliminary stuff that we're looking at. And this notion, the Supreme Court says, okay, we're going to let this is something that the states should decide, which in some theoretical way, say, okay, well, or what. But we're also have to deal with a political reality here, and maybe the court doesn't have to deal with it, but I think we certainly have to consider this, that again, we have these gerrymandered state legislatures that are going to now have the responsibility of deciding what rights women should have over their own bodies. First of all, it's a right, and therefore they shouldn't be involved in this decision at all. But if you're going to hand it off, you're going to hand it off to these legislatures that are in places that are fundamentally different than the populations that they represent.
Okay, this is a question for the two of you. I attended NYU Stern School. I did not go to NYU Law, so excuse my ignorance of some of the legal matters. But I did do Constitution and Government, at Georgetown, and the First Amendment: Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion. And Dr. Malone, my understanding from science is that a fetus is a fetus, and that the issue of whether or not it is a human being is other scientists and biologists have told me, is one of religion, philosophy. At what point is a fetus a human being? That is a subject of a discourse on religion, not of biology or of science. I've asked scientists about this. They cannot opine on this point. And so in that sense, How can there even be debates about abortion? Because abortions are very personal religious views. And how is it that the Establishment Clause seems to be irrelevant in what, to my uneducated mind, should seem to be the governing authority, and therefore people will do what they will do based on their own religion?
I mean, if you look at the Alito opinion, it's relatively recent, so it hasn't undergone the kind of scrutiny that I think that it will go through over the years. It's a pretty bad opinion. It's pretty bad. It is very selective in its examination of history. Generations and societies have dealt with this question, in a variety of ways, and have always wrestled with this notion of, when does that pack of cells become something that is considered, can be considered, life, fully formed, as opposed to just perhaps a seed. I'll defer to Sharon on that, at least the scientific part there. But at the end of the day, these are a lot of unanswered questions. And so how is it that we think that people in legislatures are better equipped to make these kinds of determinations than women, in conjunction with their doctors, their consciences, their partners? I mean, whoever should be in the relevant field there? How do we think that these legislatures, which are again predominantly men, this whole thing would be different if men could get pregnant? All right. I mean, I think this would be a fundamentally different analysis and question. But so men looking at women who tried to control in a number of ways over the years, as we talked about before, have put themselves in a place to answer the very tough questions that you are raising, and for which there are no clear answers.
And let me just give you the perspective from, being in the small room when that decision is made. Here's the good news. And the good news is that, for reasons other than choice, and let's put that in one category, where for the most part, when anyone is having a termination, I have been in conversations where women are having much wanted pregnancies. They find out that there's a fetal anomaly. It's something that's incompatible with life, or a devastating birth defect. These are situations where you can't draw a line on what time it's okay to do that and not. Because again, I think a woman and a family has the fundamental right to decide how they are going to live their lives and raise their family. This has profound implications for them. And I think that to have the argument be framed around, you could just go and have an abortion right up until the day before you deliver. That's that false argument that the right continues to have. That's not the reality of what happens in later terminations. It is because whatever. I mean, the point of the matter is that that's not for someone else to decide. There are medical reasons. There are reasons why it may not be preferable for a woman's health, or she just may not choose to. That is her right. And I think that we spend a lot of time, allowing the right, or the people, I would say the anti-choice people, to frame that argument and to make it be something that really doesn't happen in real life. And this I can tell you, is that everybody's against abortion until you need one, or your daughter needs one, or your wife needs one. And that is why it is impossible for people to say, oh, I so know what I would do. Well, that's okay, that's your choice. As you say, it's a matter of your own conscience, your conscience, your religion, but you don't get to make that choice for someone else.
I hate to do this because I know we started with questions late, but I know we have to also finish right on time. Claire, do we have time for one more question, or we have 2 minutes? Okay, so it has to be quick.
Yes, my name is Chris Ficciola, and I'm a lifetime member of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Sharon, which I'm sure you're very aware of. Been very active with civil rights, with Coretta Scott King years ago. And so my question is for both of you. Do you believe that the Supreme Court should have lifetime terms? Oh,
No, 18 years. 18
okay.
years.
And what more do you believe the Supreme Court will do to erode away civil rights?
I'm really concerned about what the court has before it even this term. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, this independent state legislature doctrine, which is nonsense. Okay, I was looking over, could I go there? All right, which is nonsense, BS, which is nonsense. That should be a 9-0 opinion. It should be 9-0. And it'll be almost embarrassing to see. I assume we're going to, we'll win that case. It's our case. It's the NDRC's case. This notion that legislatures can, independent of judicial review, independent of the involvement of their governors, can be responsible for drawing of district lines. It's totally inconsistent with this little thing called Marbury versus Madison. Law students have heard this little small case. So I'm really worried about where this court is going to go. The court has moved from a place where you're deciding things on the basis of precedent and principle to personnel. I mean, you're just doing it because you now have the votes to do those things which you did not have the capacity to do. Roe was, almost 50 years old, considered by a number of Republican conservative justices, modified, changed in a few ways, but never actually overturned until you got this group of people, on the court. And I'm really concerned about what this court's going to do. Very concerned.
Thank you.
Let's sneak in one last question really quickly.
I think it's a quick question, and it may be off the topic, but the ERA, do you think that will ever get passed? Do you think that has anything to do with anything else, like even if it got passed?
It's interesting. You've got an interesting legal question now. I mean, a number of states have actually passed it, and so if you did get a sufficient number of states, the states that initially passed it, it's happened, I think it's 30 years ago, something like that, whatever it is. Are those votes still valid? So you'd have to go through that. Is there a need for an ERA? Yeah, I think there still is. Sexism, gender-based discrimination is still a part of who we are as a people, and we as a nation, I think, should say in unequivocal terms that you can't discriminate on the basis of gender in the same way you can't discriminate on the basis of race. And all those parade of horribles that that people use to argue against the ERA have shown to be basically nonsense. I actually think that these are just that's legal, but I think these are winning political issues. I think for Democrats and for progressives, not to be Republican light in elections, but to fight and to say we're Democrats. This is what we stand for. We are for choice. We are for women's rights. These are the things that I think will drive turnout and win elections. And given this Supreme Court, that's, I think, what we have to do. We can't rely on the courts to the degree that we have in the past. We have to win elections.
That is as good a note as any to end our evening on. I'm so grateful to both of you.
Can I say one
for
thing?
being here. Say as many things as you'd like.
And this is to all these unbelievably bright young people here, and for those of you who are young at heart. We see great progress based on last Tuesday. We've seen great progress in this country, from Vivian in 1963 to an African American president of the United States. That didn't just happen. That happened because people committed themselves to making the change happen, that people sacrificed, people gave their lives, and that is what we have to do. Positive change is not promised. It's a function of the commitment we put to making that change occur. We have within ourselves the capacity to make this change occur, and I think each and every one of you has to ask yourselves is, what are you doing? What are you doing to make this change possible? It's not enough to look at the TV and throw something at, somebody says something on MSNBC, or God forbid you're looking at Fox. Something's, what are you doing to make this change occur? Sharon's heard me say this a lot. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like us put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. So ask yourself, what are you doing to pull that arc towards justice? This is something that we can do. This is something that we must do. We can do this. We can do this.
And in every strong marriage, the woman should have the last word. So Sharon, last word goes to you here.
You know what? I'm going to let him have the last
Ah,
word for the
that's
first
even-
time. For the first time.
Thank you both so much for this evening. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
a real
you.
treat and gift for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.